Hello everyone, this is Thersites the Historian, and tonight we're going to go ahead with Military Blunders Volume 2. As you can see, I had to change the title a bit because Sean will not be able to join us this evening. He is feeling under the weather. Nonetheless, we will proceed and we will look at 2 military blunders. We'll be looking at one of the battles that I find the most interesting from the Three Kingdoms period, but for reasons that will soon become apparent. And we'll also be looking at a battle that many people have requested, the Battle of Carrhae. The only question I have is, do you want to do the Three Kingdoms battle first, or would you prefer to go to Carrhae first and fight the Parthians alongside of Crassus? Don't answer all at once. Well, you know what? I'll choose then. So, this battle has stuck with me since about 2001 when I first picked up this game, so it's been 20 years. And the reason why the battle stuck with me is because I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Dynasty Warriors games, but some of the videos they put in, some of the cutscenes are rather out there. So, I'm going to show you why I was interested in this battle first, and then we'll talk about what actually happened historically, because the way that Dynasty Warriors presents the battle is actually not terribly accurate. But let's just jump into it, and then work our way backwards from Dynasty Warriors.
Report from the spies! The main Shu force has definitely camped!
So, was the enemy camp pretty?
What? It was normal, I suppose?
People! We must destroy their formation with a beautiful one of our own. This is the art of battle. Now, you will see!
Okay. So let's go back just a bit and look at the map. I don't care about the intro because I'm going to provide that part. Okay, so here, this is actually inaccurate. It has most of the Shu forces being present on the same battlefield. The truth is that this was a separate battle, sort of to the south and east of where the main force under Zhuge Liang was. Wei Yan was nearby, but Ma Chao wasn't by virtue of being dead. On the Wei side of the equation, Sima Yi and Zhang He were on the scene, but Cao Zhen was elsewhere. And then this is actually Cao Pi, the Emperor's wife, Zhen Ji. She was not present at this battle, to the best of my knowledge. She was probably back at the capital. But in Dynasty Warriors, they wanted to have a certain number of female characters, so, you know, they put her in. Anyway, this hill represents the place where Masu actually encamped, and that's probably somewhat like what it would have looked like in terms of standing out as the one big hill in an area that didn't have that kind of a terrain feature. The way that they have the battle play out, you, as Zhang He, or whatever Wei general is fighting alongside of Zhang He, you have to cut off Masu at the top of the hill, and then charge down somehow. Even though he's on high ground, you charge downhill at him. So the way they have the battle constructed makes no sense, but it stuck with me due to that previous cutscene where he's talking about the enemy camp being pretty, and also because of his second little cameo here.
A downhill charge, like falling blossoms. My people, let's dance around them!
So, that is our nightly dose of Dynasty Warriors. Anyway, let me see if I can pull up a few representative images as we figure out how to explain this battle a little better than what Koei provided. And also, I haven't played enough of the sequel games. I've played most of them through once, but never in any great detail, so I don't know how they present Jiting. But I imagine they present the battle a little more accurately than Dynasty Warriors 3. Alright. Hopefully there's a map in here somewhere. There's... well, okay. This will be useful. Although, I think this basically shows two different campaigns. The point... okay, so actually this was to the west. I was a little wrong about the geography. But in all of... let me explain the general context first. So by 228, the three kingdoms have been established. You have Shu Han, Carrhae, and Eastern Wu. Carrhae is by far the most important and powerful, but they have had some change-ups over the last few years, and they no longer have Cao Cao, the great leader who founded the country. He's been dead for about 8 years. Shu Han was also founded by charismatic leader Liu Bei and his two sworn brothers, Zhang Fei and Guan Yu. They're all dead now. Liu Bei died in 223 after leading a disastrous attack on Wu to avenge the death of Guan Yu. Zhuge Liang, the chief strategist of Shu and also the prime minister, had advised Liu Bei not to do that because he said that it was important that Shu and Wu fight together to fight Wei because they are at such a disadvantage. Now that Liu Bei's dead, that is what is happening for the most part. For the next 30 to 40 years, Shu and Wu will be on one side in the south, Wei will be in the north, and they will team up to fight against Wei. Although, even with both of them fighting together, Wei is still stronger. So, some of you might be familiar with this period from playing the games or from reading the novel or what have you. But it's important to note that most of the famous figures, militarily speaking, are dead. So for Wei, their generals such as Zhang Liao, Zhahou Dun, Zhahao Yuan, almost all of those guys are dead. The only major figures left in terms of the generals who had been winning acclaim earlier are Zhu Huang and Zhang He. And by the way, Zhang He is the guy we just saw in the video with the no shirt and the claws. In history and in the novel, he's a guy who doesn't really get much of a personality, so just kind of assumed to be a hard-ass veteran soldier. This is a guy who's been serving since the 180s, so he's probably 60 or so years old at least. And he doesn't come across as a guy who has much of a sense of humor, but he's very professional and accomplished. For whatever reason, Koei decided to make him Vega from Street Fighter 2. A decision I'm okay with. But I have no idea how they got to that point. I'd love to know. Also, the major strategist in Wei is now a guy named Sima Yi, who has been in and out of power for the last decade, as he's been in and out of favor with different rulers. So when Cao Pi was the emperor up to 226, Sima Yi fell out of favor. And now Cao Pi's son, Carrhae, who's only about 20 or so, has come to power, and Sima Yi helped to defuse a conspiracy by one of the generals elsewhere, so now Carrhae has put him back in power and given him control of the West. The basic goal for Zhuge Liang to try to gain more power to break this stalemate, a stalemate which, by the way, which favors Wei in the long run because Wei has a bigger population, and ultimately will be able to overwhelm the other two. He wants to capture the city of Chang'an right here. This is an old imperial capital. It's probably really at this time the only huge city in the west. And once you take this, it opens up the central plains, which are over here. This is where most of the wealth and population of China at this time was. And as you can see, all of the terrain to the south, this border between Shu and Wei, lots of opportunities for ambushes and difficult mountain battles. And then you have the Xiongnu. Sometimes people say that they're the Huns. They're up here. This is the Mongolian steppe. And there are also some nomadic peoples around here. So this area is not super settled at this time. So, what ends up happening is that the Wei forces in this particular campaign are actually outnumbered because they're having to fight on two fronts, and they just had to deal with a major uprising. As I mentioned, a lot of their major generals are dead. Zhu Huang died putting down that revolt that Sima Yi was fighting against. Zhu Huang was serving under him in that battle. So now the only senior general who's basically a leader of men is Zhang He. You have Cao Zhen, who is a cousin of Carrhae, and then you have Sima Yi, who's sort of the grand commander. On the Shu side of things, you have Zhuge Liang, who is not only prime minister but also commander-in-chief. He has a couple of young assistants under him. Masu is basically his best friend. They're both scholars, and they usually hang out in the same tent. He will entrust a lot of authority to Masu in this campaign. It will turn out to be a bit of a disaster. There's also Zhao Yun, who's now over 70. He is famous for being one of the great warriors of this period. On several occasions, he has really distinguished himself in individual combat or by putting himself at great risk. And despite his advanced age, he's still effective. However, he's not really a great general. He's more of a hothead who just charges in and relies on his physical strength and skill. There's also Wei Yan, who in Dynasty Warriors, for whatever reason, is portrayed as a barbarian. He is a bit of an egotist, but there's no reason to think he's a barbarian. He is a strategist in his own right, but he takes a lot more risk than Zhuge Liang. When he follows orders, he's a very effective general, but he's a guy you kind of have to work with a lot to keep in line because his ego is pretty big and he gets offended pretty easily. But when he's used properly, he's very deadly. And they have a few other generals, but nobody particularly worth mentioning except for Wang Ping, who will be a subordinate under Masu in this battle. Wang Ping is not ultra talented, but he is a man with great sense who will typically do well. I guess a couple other notable officers are Ma Dai, the younger brother of Ma Chao, who recently died. He is a Zhuge Liang guy, very capable leader, obedient. And then Zhang Wei is a very young strategist who fought against Shu as a part of Wei at one point. He joined up with Zhuge Liang a few years ago, and now he's basically his protege. So anyhow, when Zhuge Liang's looking at the map, he realizes that if the enemy were to come through Jiting, they could then sweep into the rear, and this would mess up the Shu logistics and give the Wei army a route directly into Shu. So he says, I need a force to hold this position through the pass, and if we hold that position, then our rear will be secure, and we can focus on trying to seize the city of Chang'an. And at that point, Masu volunteered. Now, Zhuge Liang was a little hesitant because Masu had never really done an independent command before. He thought that Masu was a man of great learning and talent, but he just didn't have a lot of relevant experience. And there's also a story in Romance of the Three Kingdoms that on his deathbed, Liu Bei warned Zhuge Liang against empowering his friend Masu. Liu Bei basically said, look, I get that he's your friend and he's a smart guy, but this is not a responsible person. He cannot handle major commands. He doesn't have it in him. Of course, you can't really blame Zhuge Liang for not taking that advice too seriously since, as I mentioned, Liu Bei was just recovering from a massive military defeat that he himself engineered. So Liu Bei was never much of a general. So the idea that he could recognize someone else's general makes this someone else's generalship, makes this a pretty spurious story. Anyhow. So Masu marches off with his men and Wang Ping, and Wang Ping's idea is that they should find where the roads intersect and then use the local woods to set up a wooden barrier to block the road. And if you do that, then when the enemy converges, they will have a lot of trouble deploying, and your small force will be able to hold them off, and they will be forced to go elsewhere, and you'll have plenty of time to rush in reinforcements as needed. Or, better yet, just keep them there and let Zhuge Liang press hard against Chang'an. But Masu looks at the terrain and he says, there's no way in hell they can come through here. This place is extremely rugged and secure. There's a nice hill over here. We should just camp on the hill. The hill will overlook the entirety of the position, and we'll be fine. Wang Ping, who's a more experienced practical soldier, said, well, Zhuge Liang's orders are to fortify at the crossroads, and the crossroads is over there. Masu says, dude, trust me. I've read all the books, and the books tell me that this hill is where it's at. So ultimately, they haggle a bit, and Masu enables him. It allows Wang Ping to lead off a very small percentage of the force to go set up a roadblock, but this force is nowhere near heavy enough to really hold back an army. And Masu basically mocks him, saying that he's behaving like a woman, he doesn't understand warfare, and also that when he holds this pass successfully, he's not going to share any of the credit with Wang Ping. And going into this campaign, Masu had really staked everything on it because Zhuge Liang said, this is extremely important. Are you sure you can do it? Masu's response was, I swear on my life, either I will hold the position as promised, or you can execute me. I will not fail you. Zhuge Liang agreed. So Masu has taken a pledge on his life to hold this position. When Sima Yi arrives in Chang'an, Carrhae greets him, and the two of them become close for the first time. Sima Yi is then given more or less complete control of the campaign, and he decides that this point over here is the key. He needs to turn Zhuge Liang's flank. So this is exactly what Zhuge Liang had predicted. Sima Yi goes with Zhang He, and one of Sima Yi's sons, who will later basically be emperor in his own right at the very beginning of what becomes the Jin Dynasty, different story for a different day, goes out to do the scouting for this mission. His name is Sima Zhao. And he reports to Sima Yi, yes, this pass is garrisoned. So Sima Yi at first is a little bit unhappy because he thinks, alright, my plan is not going to work. Zhuge Liang has anticipated it, so I'm going to have to do something else. But then his son says, oh, don't worry, Dad. He camped up on the hill. And the reason why everybody except Masu understood that was a problem is because when you camp on a hill, you can be cut off. And even though you can get a lot of momentum charging downhill, and you can charge downhill like falling blossoms, people have plenty of time to get out of the way because they will see you coming. And then you're playing a cat and mouse game that you can't win, and there typically is not a lot of fresh water or food on the top of a hill. So Sima Yi figured this out immediately, and he and Zhang He began to assault the position. What ensued is a pretty mixed up, confusing battle. I'm not going to go through every single detail of it, but effectively what happened is Sima Yi put Zhang He between Masu and Wang Ping's forces, so they couldn't really help each other, while he cut off Masu and then denied him battle when Masu would try to charge downhill. Masu's men were becoming very disheartened by everything that was going on, and they were threatening to mutiny. There was also a nearby force under Wei Yan, who was effectively kind of holding the gap between some of the other forces over here to the more to the east and Jiting. So Wei Yan arrives with reinforcements. So what Sima Yi effectively does is to let Masu go, because he figures it will be easier to cut down his men in pursuit if he has him on the run and not up on a hill. So Masu's men break out, but only because Sima Yi wants them to, and then the Wei army starts to pursue. They inflict pretty bad losses on Wang Ping and Masu. Wei Yan joins. He turns the tide for a bit, but then there are more Wei reinforcements. Then there are more Shu reinforcements, but the battle is steadily moving south. And eventually Zhuge Liang himself arrives on the scene, and at one point he is nearly captured, because his forces are overall taking the worst of all this. In the end, it is up to Zhao Yun arriving with another force that was held in reserve, that was probably slated to attack here. And also, the two young sons of Zhang Fei and Guan Yu arrive as well. And it's a pretty close run thing, but ultimately, what really helped to bail out Zhuge Liang is that Sima Yi was being pretty cautious. As I said, he didn't have a huge army going into this, so he had to be somewhat cautious. And also, he was a little bit cautious by nature. So, when they had Zhuge Liang dead to rights at one point, where it was at, I think it was at the city of Longshan right here, Zhuge Liang did not have enough men to defend the city, so what he did is he just left the gates open, making it look like a trap. So then Sima Yi said, okay, I see what he's trying to do here, it's clearly a trap, and backed off. And later on, Sima Yi would basically laugh it off when he learned it was a trap and say, okay, he got me again. But, make no mistake about it, the 228 campaign was a Wei victory any way you look at it. I don't know exactly how much they retook. They did not recapture Hanzhong, which Shu had taken back in 219, but they probably did take pretty much all this stuff in here. And I want to say the new General Zhang Wei's mom lived at Tianshui right here, so they had to send for her and move her to the south. So, complete disaster. And one of the plans they rejected early on, when they were planning the campaign early in the year, Wei Yan wanted to lead about 10,000 men through this extremely rough patch here, and then attack Chang'an from the south. He anticipated taking a fair amount of losses, but then combining that with another advance from somewhere else. Pretty risky strategy, but in retrospect, it's better than putting Masu in command of anything. Needless to say, there were rewards and punishments for what had happened. Sima Yi's position as the Chief General Wei was confirmed. Zhang He was also very much elevated, although he will die 3 years later, so it didn't really help him as much. For Sima Yi, he will become very close with Carrhae, and when Carrhae dies young and childless in 239, Sima Yi will become regent, and that will put him and his sons into a position where they can then begin to completely dominate the government and ultimately install themselves as the new ruling dynasty. In the south, in Shu, Zhuge Liang formally demoted himself, although he was still in charge of everything, to show that this had been his fault, among others. He offered to reward Zhao Yun for basically saving the day, but Zhao Yun said, you don't reward people for fucking up and failing. So ultimately, because of pressure and because a lot of people knew about the oath that Masu had sworn, Zhuge Liang had to execute his best friend for failure. He did, however, end up raising Masu's kids. So, yeah. Anyway, pretty sad moment for Zhuge Liang. And although Zhuge Liang is typically considered to be one of the great strategists of Chinese history, I actually think he's pretty overrated. If you look at all of his northern expeditions, I think he has 5 or 6, and then in 240 to 260-ish, his successor, Zhang Wei, will launch, I think, 9 more. And all of them are basically repeats of the same ideas. They never really come up with a new strategy. They never pursue a new path to try to get around Chang'an or to try to break the stalemate of the Three Kingdoms some other way. They can just keep trying the same thing over and over and over. So yeah, anyway, this was the first indication that perhaps the strategy might be a bit of a risk. And also, in the future, I do plan on doing another battle from this year called Jiting, which is the word shitting, but with one less T. And that battle is between Wei and Wu. Anyway, this is the Battle of Jiting. A downhill charge like falling blossoms. So anyway, that is all I have on that. Let me recover for just a second, and then we can go to Parthia. Let's get ourselves a picture of Marcus Crassus going. Parthia. That's way too generous. That is not accurate. Yeah, of the three great ancient Persian empires, Parthia is definitely the weakest. Close enough. The border's probably a little generous for Parthia, but this isn't too bad. We'll go with that. See if we can find a Parthian mounted archer here. Well, here we have Cataphracts. This is one of the mounted warriors. And we also have this, the famous Parthian shot. The technique of nomadic warriors the world over. You can fire backwards while riding on your horse. The idea being not so much that this is effective. It's really not that effective since you don't have the momentum of riding forward. But what it does is it urges the enemy to pursue you. And then when they pursue you, you can counterattack at your leisure. Since your force will probably have more momentum and more mobility, this is a way for this army to gain an advantage. So a bit of backdrop on the Parthians before we talk about why Rome is getting involved in this war. The Parthian Empire was effectively the direct successor to the Seleucid Empire. The Parthians sprang up in a part of western Iran and slowly took over territory from the Seleucids. Finally, when the Seleucids were dissolved by Pompey, the Parthians were officially and completely done with them. Although they had been done with them for a while by that point, and the Seleucid Empire was really only the rump state of Antioch by the time that Pompey came along, but you get the idea. Parthia was divided into 7 areas based on the 7 great families of the kingdom. It was kind of like the Holy Roman Empire in a way. The king himself was not super strong and was always heavily dependent on the support of the great lords. Kings changed fairly rapidly, and there just wasn't a great deal of central control. So Parthia will never really pose a great offensive threat to the Romans. By the time the Persians become a problem for Rome in terms of being able to take over territory, that is when the Romans are dealing with the Sasanians, which are a new dynasty and a new phase in Persian or Iranian history. The Sasanians will be a pretty major power, but the Parthians are much less so. That being said, they can still be deadly if they're defending their homeland and if they are offended by the war that is being waged against them. Now, as a lot of you know, by the time you get to the 50s BCE, the Roman Republic has become the first triumvirate. Crassus is one of the three men calling the shots, the other two being Pompey and Caesar. Crassus's fame derived from his great wealth. He was born effectively as the wealthiest man in Rome, and he invested in a lot of slums and tenements, which made him even richer. Up until Pompey's conquest of the East, he remained the richest man in Rome, and after that point, they became great rivals with one another, and for the most part, they did not get along terribly well, even after they were reconciled and became allies on a formal basis. But Crassus was missing something in his resume, despite being one of the three men who elect most of the magistrates and really call the shots. He had never really gotten a great deal of military glory. Sure, he had been the primary general during the war against Spartacus, the Third Servile War. But a lot of his thunder had been stolen by Pompey, who arrived in time to clean up some of the stragglers. And his performance in that war actually wasn't all that impressive to begin with. He beat a bunch of slaves, most of whom were not armed, a lot of whom did not really speak the same language. They weren't really coherent. There was no grand strategy involved. So Crassus won effectively against a revolt which had very little chance of actually succeeding in the first place. But Crassus was very eager to get in on the action before he was too old. By the time he began his Parthian campaign, he was already 60 to 62 years old. And one encouraging sign for him is that his son, Publius Crassus, had been serving under Caesar as a legate and doing extremely well. So he takes his son with him to go to the east, because he knows that his son's a capable soldier. And Caesar also sends 1,000 Gallic cavalry in addition. These men are hardened veterans, and they are known for being good in mounted warfare. Now, as you might know, and as is obvious to everyone except the Romans on occasion, when you're fighting a force which is mostly mounted, when you're fighting these guys, you need a lot of horsemen. You need to be fast. You need mobility. And the Romans were not ever that great when it came to cavalry. Their infantry were the best, but their mounted arm tended to be outnumbered and also not of the highest quality. And in this campaign, there won't be much of an exception. Another thing that Crassus did not have going for him in this campaign is that he had no element of surprise whatsoever. The Parthians knew about his campaign from the time he left Rome. So effectively, in 55, he decided, I'm going to Parthia, and I'm going to conquer it, or at least some part of it, and win military glory. And he announced his intentions in public in Rome. And because Rome had a treaty with Parthia at this time, dating back to Pompey's settlement of the East, Crassus had no casus belli. The Parthians had not violated the treaty in any way. So even by Roman standards, where you can make up some really ridiculous reasons for going to war, Crassus did not bother to do that. He was simply going to go to Syria, raise an army, and invade. And even though we know that the Romans were very hypocritical about this kind of stuff, they did take their thinly veiled excuses seriously, because they thought that was enough to keep the favor of the gods. One of the tribunes, Aetius, I can't remember his, Aetius Capito, there we go, said that the war was impious. So he said, I'm not going to allow this, I'm putting forward my tribunician veto. He tried everything in his power to stop Crassus, and he also performed rituals which sort of separated Rome from Crassus. Crassus wasn't as bothered by this as you might think. He figured that he was going to steamroll forward. He may have overestimated his abilities just a bit. We have to remember about Crassus that while now, because of Carrhae, we tend to think of him as being a blundering moron, he had never really fucked anything up to this point. I mean, like I said, he didn't do great during the wars with Spartacus, but he did well enough. And before that, he had fought and won a battle on Sulla's behalf during the civil wars of the 80s. He also had been a pretty accomplished politician. While he relied heavily on his wealth, he was also a pretty good speaker. He was a very precise speaker, so he did well in courtroom settings as a defender. So he could go in and cite all the facts of the case, talk about case law, and be pretty on point. I mean, he wasn't setting the world on fire like Cicero, but he was perfectly competent. And he also was very good at making alliances and all of that kind of stuff. So he had no idea that he was incompetent, in other words. He'd always been able to succeed up to this point. He did not know what he was getting himself into. I also have reason to believe that Crassus didn't really understand the terrain of the East at all. There is some evidence in Plutarch that the men were upset that Mesopotamia was so dry. Drinking water was harder to come by, the humidity was low, so the weather was not comfortable for them. They were out of sorts. The other big legate in this campaign is the now famous Cassius Longinus. Not Quintus Cassius Longinus, the guy we talked about from Spain, who created a rebellion for Caesar, but the famous Cassius Longinus, Gaius Cassius Longinus, one of the assassins of Caesar. And in a campaign which mostly created failure and just really hurt Rome morally, there is a hero of the campaign, and that is Gaius Cassius Longinus. And that is actually what gives him the kind of standing later to become a major conspirator. But we'll get there when we get there. So, Crassus was in a hurry to get to Syria to start building his army. So in late 55, he departed from Brundisium with sort of the core of his army and a treasury. Despite it being winter and the weather being rough, he was in a hurry, so he just kind of went ahead. Some of the ships that were in his group sank and men were lost, but Crassus didn't care. He then crossed overland through the Balkans and Asia Minor, raising men and money. He stopped by a client king's place and saw that the guy was building a new city, and he kind of mocked him for his age, and the king fired back, "Weren't you a little old to be embarking on a major conquest?" There also were lots and lots of negative omens throughout this entire process. Basically, anytime Crassus entered a building, something would fall, or somebody would sneeze, or other little things that people regarded as bad omens. And Crassus did not handle them all that well, and the cumulative impact of this is that people began to think that there was something seriously wrong with Crassus's campaign, that the gods had it in for him. I don't think the gods did have it in for him, I just think that Crassus fundamentally failed to understand the situation. So, in 54, he's in Syria raising troops. He will eventually amass an army that has about 40,000 total men. And I believe he has 7 legions. So each legion would have maybe 6,000 men of heavy infantry. And then he amassed auxiliaries, about 4,000 or so cavalry, and about 4,000 or so light infantry, who could sort of do some of the same things as the cavalry in terms of guarding the flanks, doing scouting, foraging, etc. But the problem is, pretty much all of the men that the Parthians will throw at him will be mounted. So effectively, only 8,000 out of 40,000 of his men are capable of fighting back unless the enemy gets to close quarters. Now, there are some men who are cataphracts, these heavily armored men who get in close with spears. And I believe in the thumbnail to this video I used cataphracts. But the mainstay are the mounted archers. Cataphracts were pretty much just nobles, unless I'm mistaken. So, one of Crassus's allies and neighbors King Artavasdes of Armenia told him, I'm an old enemy of the Parthians. If you would like to march north through my territory, we avoid letting them harass you on the march. Their cavalry will be way less effective in this rugged terrain, and then we can fall down the Mesopotamian valley, which is a lot wetter and more lush than the surrounding desert, so the advantage that they have in mounted men will count for a lot less. And also, if you come this way, I will reinforce you with a significant number of men. About 46,000 men total, including roughly 15,000 mounted soldiers. That sounds like a pretty good deal. Crassus said, nah. Crassus instead opted to do a campaign which had a two-pronged assault, the Roman assault and the Armenian. At some point, also during 54, he received news that there were revolts in the cities of Seleucia and Babylon, which would be somewhere approximately right here-ish. These are pretty much the two richest targets in the area anyway, so you might think he might want to start early to try to take advantage of the turmoil of the Civil War. Because yes, Parthia was having a civil war right as the Romans were about to invade. The old king Phraates III had died a few years before, and then his two sons had taken over, and now they were fighting a civil war. The younger son would ultimately win, but by the time that Crassus is invading in 53, this son will be less than a year in power. So Crassus is striking while the iron is hot, and a lot of the opportunity that he is taking advantage of is something that he couldn't quite foresee. He only knew in 55 that old Phraates III was gone, but he thought the two brothers would get along. Now, he had the opportunity to strike in the middle of a literal civil war, failed to take it, and he also had a great offer from his neighbor who knows the terrain and the nature of warfare in this region way better than he does. So he's already made two massive errors going into this campaign. And a third, he did not recruit more horsemen. And it would appear also that the Parthians shared the Roman perception of Crassus's campaign, that it was simply opportunistic. It was unjust, and it was a simple cash grab. Crassus thought that he was going to win an easy victory over an enemy which did not have the wherewithal to fight him back. So, at first, when they're advancing through the desert, the Parthians are keeping their distance. They can see the dust from the horses. And the Romans interpret this as, oh, they're scared. They know they don't have anything to fight us. We're going to win. We're going to reach their cities. They're going to surrender. We're going to leave here loaded down with treasure and glory. What they don't know is that despite the fact that the new king is not very experienced, he still has a pretty good handle on things. The new king is named Orodes II. And his chief general is a man named Surena. So, Orodes II decides that he needs to prevent the junction of the Armenian and Roman forces. He takes the main army himself and goes into Armenia to hold down Artavasdes. So all of the fighting that we're going to talk about and all of the accounts you might have read about Carrhae do not involve the king of Parthia at all. They do involve his chief general, whom the Romans name as Surena. Most likely a very Latinized form of his actual name. Surena is the best Parthian general of this time, and he is also the second most powerful man in the entire kingdom. He's one of the great lords, and he effectively made sure that the civil war went to Orodes rather than Mithridates IV. So effectively, what happens is you have three parts of Crassus' army, one under Cassius, which is, I think, the rear guard, the main infantry force under Crassus himself, and then the vanguard with a great deal of the light troops under the younger Crassus, Publius. The strategy seems to be to draw the light troops away from the heavy troops and annihilate them separately. And to achieve this, what Surenna does is he strikes first at the infantry, and the infantry, of course, are helpless because they're being shot at by guys on horses with bows. So while he's under fire, Crassus orders his son to counterattack. And his son does counterattack, and he ends up chasing the enemy several miles, and then the enemy wheels about, gets reinforced, and they enter into a desperate melee. Meanwhile, other forces are keeping Crassus pinned down where he's at. Ultimately, in the melee, the Parthians win, and later Crassus will learn that his son's been defeated. He actually takes this pretty manfully. I mean, it's a pretty hard blow to lose his son. He was very proud of his son by all indications, and he was really looking forward to seeing his son win accolades from this campaign and go on to be consul and, really have this long career of great achievement. He would achieve all the military success that Crassus himself had always longed for. And that was actually one of the aims of this campaign, is to let his son go out and show how awesome he is. So anyway, he took it manfully. He told his soldiers, guys, I know we're in a pickle here. I will grieve later. For now, if we're going to take revenge for my son, let's just kill some Parthians and cut our way out of this. But his men had really lost faith pretty badly. They saw that he had blundered. He had also made some serious errors in their eyes by sort of taking a light view of all of the bad omens that kept accumulating. There was one time where somebody handed him a liver from one of the sacrifices and it slipped out of his hand, and he said, "Yeah, I guess I'm getting old, but don't worry, I can grip my sword when I need to." So anyway, the troops are on the verge of mutiny, and effectively they offer the command to Cassius, but he refuses. Because good old Cassius, he is incapable of disloyalty. At least he was at this time. So he refuses to take command. Maybe he just doesn't want his name associated too closely with what is obviously going to be an epic defeat. Crassus is forced by his men to surrender, and when he meets with the Parthians, they do not observe the norms of war because Crassus did not observe them for his part. He invaded them while a treaty was still in effect. So they take him to their camp, and according to stories, they then took molten gold and poured it down his throat. This is because Crassus was famously greedy. In Rome, he built tenement buildings that collapsed and killed people because he didn't put enough time or effort into making them properly. He was a moneylender. He did a lot of shady stuff. He had no real limits on what he was willing to do to make money. And in this campaign, they saw it as Crassus effectively trying to rob them. So they put him out of his misery in a pretty graphic way that was fitting for his personality failure. Cassius managed to get the survivors back into Roman territory, and when the Parthians launched a counterattack the next year, Cassius was actually able to mount a credible defense with a small and pretty battered army. He actually killed a Parthian general in battle, and that is what really secured his name as someone with a bright future. Of course, Cassius, later assassinated Caesar. Otherwise, he probably would have gone down with a much more positive reputation. But as it stands, his literary reputation is as one of the two guys in the ninth circle of hell being punished as a traitor. So, anyway, I think we can see that this was one of the greater blunders of Roman military history. And I've talked to Sean. We're probably going to try to run this back fairly soon when he's available. He'll do the ones that he had planned. I'll do 2 new ones. So what I'll probably do is the follow-up to this battle, which is an interesting one. It occurs about 15 years later under another famous triumvir. And I will also then do the Battle of Jiting, which occurred the same year as Jiting. All right. So that's pretty much all I have for you. Well, I mean, I guess Crassus was a real general, he just wasn't a very good one. I'm not sure how many times they had faced horse archers before. This might be the first time, actually. At least when they faced a large number. I mean, because Pompey did not venture too far into the hinterlands when he was campaigning. Rome 2, Ctesiphon. Okay. Alright. Well, that's all I had for you this evening. I guess I didn't realize how much all of the various back and forth that I usually have with Sean, how much time that actually takes up. But yeah, that's it for now. Unless anybody has any really pressing questions for the evening. Why didn't Rome put more effort into having a good cavalry corps? I don't know. I mean, because Italy's not terrible horse country. And then Sicily had a good tradition. Gaul had a good tradition. I think a lot of it is they just preferred to hire people. Once they get to the professionalized empire, they prefer to just hire people who have the skill rather than training it at home. Somebody got unsubscribed, apparently, by YouTube. Yeah, I noticed my sub count randomly dropped a few days ago. YouTube does that at random, and I'm not sure why. They say it's supposedly to deal with inactive accounts and to make sure that I have an accurate sub count, because that's something I'm really concerned about, you know? I always wonder, like, man, do I have any fake subs? Shit, can't have that. Most overrated emperor, most underrated, I'll have to think about that for a minute. What are the best books to read about the late Republic and Aurelian? What is your favorite emperor and why? Well, best book about the late Republic that I've encountered, I would say Caesar, a biography by Christian Meyer. Very thorough explanation of the politics. In terms of the best book about Aurelian, there are only a few to choose from to begin with, so you're kind of just forced to read the ones that exist. And I can't really say I'm an Aurelian expert, actually. Favorite emperor? I'm kind of partial to Claudius, but I don't know. That's a good question. I actually don't really usually have a lot of favorites for things. At least not clear favorites. Most overrated Roman emperor. I'll say Constantine. I feel like he gets a lot of credit for things that Diocletian did, or at least started. So he's more of a continuator. And most of his military deeds were accomplished against other Romans in civil wars. Most underrated. I guess at this point Aurelian is pretty well appreciated. He used to be the most underrated. Who tends to be underrated? I feel like I don't want to call him underrated because he's definitely a bad emperor. I feel like people overstate how bad Nero was. So I guess he might even qualify as being underrated just because he's really more of a D, but people act as if he's a Z on a tier list. Because if you actually look at his reign, it was mostly peaceful and prosperous. And most of the dumb shit he did didn't have too bad of an impact on life in general. Yeah, and the Parthian shot tactics and the circling would have been very unnerving. Should Hannibal have secured Spain and pressured Sicily? I don't know how he would have gone about doing that. I mean, he basically had Spain secured. All of the parts that Carthage had previously owned remained Carthaginian. The only parts that the Romans took over in the north were thinly held by a 10,000 man army that had just arrived. So it was, they weren't really losing any core territories, and they didn't have any mines up there or any long-lasting alliances or anything like that. And then as for threatening Sicily, the problem with that is that Rome can raise up most of its manpower without having key allies close to home defecting. So I don't know if putting pressure on Sicily has the same impact on undermining Roman morale that putting pressure closer to home has. What is my writing research process for videos? It depends on the video. So for something like this, I just take notes and I read about the battles and the campaigns. And I just have a list of notes, and I usually don't get to consult them as much as I'd like. I find that just writing down the notes in the first place helps to organize my thoughts to some extent. For more lecture-style videos, I have notes, then I make the presentations from the notes, and I sort of think out what I'll say and pace myself with the bullet points, and then when I record, I just make sure that I cover everything in the bullet points and the things that I couldn't include because of space. And then for some other videos where I actually have written scripts, I will actually just type out the script and either have to print it or have a program where I can look at a different window and read from the script. So, I mean, it just really depends from video to video. And it also depends on how well I know a topic in terms of what I look up. So for a lot of the Roman stuff, I mean, I've read the primary sources before, so I usually brush up on that. But then I'll try to read something new that I've never looked at before. Some new secondary account that I've never looked up about a particular topic, just to get, a little bit of a fresh perspective, see what else is being said about a thing. And also, since also with a lot of these, it'll be the first time I've looked at something in a while. So I'll find that due to learning other stuff, it now puts it in a fresh light. So then I try to keep in mind other things that I've talked about recently and see how things fit together. Elaborate on Pompeius Strabo's military colony in Picenum. I don't actually know that much about Strabo's colony. I do know that this gave Strabo and his son Pompey a huge heads up in politics, though. And I don't think it's a first. The Romans often did found colonies, but I'm not sure if any of the previous colonies had been in the Marian era, where you have troops who are super loyal to a particular general. Yeah, Hadrian is good, and everybody knows Elagabalus is great. I mean, I don't think there's any real controversy or debate on that. I mean, Elagabalus clearly is S tier, as we all know. Thoughts on Elia Kazan? I'm not sure who that is right offhand. I would be cautious about lead-based explanations. Usually when it comes to the lead-based pipes, the thing is they get filled with lime and that blocks any more lead from getting in the water. So only new pipes have that problem. The older pipes, because of lime buildup, you wouldn't really be getting that much lead in the water. And also you wouldn't have lead poisoning all across the empire all at once anyway. So all the lead explanations are a little bit underwhelming. Oh, I see other people have been talking about lead. Have you written any books? Well, I'm writing a dissertation right now. It literally is a book. I also have an idea for a joke. Well, a book that will be a joke. And I have a little document started for it. And the book, the tentative title is Luigi Cadorna, Military Genius. I'm not going to do any real research for this book because it's obviously a fucking joke. I'm just going to make up shit and go with the bare minimum of detail, but just make the counterintuitive argument that Cadorna is a misunderstood military genius and that everyone just failed to understand how awesome he was. And that he was right about the need for the strict discipline. And then I'm going to take this book. What I'm going to do is try to write it from like a neo-reactionary perspective. So I'm just going to throw in a lot of moralizing crap. Then I'm going to send it to some random right-wing publisher and see if they'll take the bait and give me money for it. I'm not kidding. This is actually something I'm planning on doing. And I have notes for that in the same notebook that I was working out of tonight. I have found a publisher that I think might be dumb enough to go for this. But we'll see. Yeah, and Cadorna was absolutely robbed after Caporetto. I mean, that was clearly not his fault at all. And if they had left him in charge after Caporetto instead of Diaz, then they would have won much more quickly and overwhelmingly. So, you know. Thoughts on Sulla? Sulla is an interesting historical figure. The last of the great dictators, really, unless you count Caesar. His reforms ultimately failed because he thought that as long as you have the cursus honorum in place that, you know, people won't do things that they're not supposed to do. But that was pretty naive. Yeah, it's too bad that Sulla spent as much or more of his time and talent fighting other Romans rather than expanding the empire. If the Roman Empire had been more stable at the time, or if his opponents had been better at reconciling with him on some level, I feel like he could have accomplished a great deal in the East, and maybe he would have had the Pompey settlement 20 years early. But ultimately, Sulla was much more interested in dealing with Marius than continuing to expand in the East. I don't know a great deal about steel in terms of the different qualities. Goofiest Roman. That's a tough one. Man. Goofiest Roman. A lot of them weren't goofy in the sense that we think of goofy. If I had to go with the goofiest Roman, the guy that I like to make fun of the most is Scipio Metellus. Just because he was completely incompetent and could not ever provide good service or good advice. I mean, every time he's recorded in history, he's always saying or doing something that's incredibly dumb. And he was the senior guy in the Optimate faction in the late Republic. Make no mistake about it. If you look at the nexus of family connections, his rank, he was clearly the senior guy. Later, they try to pretend, well, Cato was actually our leader. No, he was not. He was not a consul. Not the leader. It was fucking Metellus Scipio. And that's part of why they did so horribly. Are you a big Yellow River Boys fan? I'm not sure what that is. Was Mesopotamia an attainable goal for the Romans, or was it an overreach? Good question. The problem with Mesopotamia is that the lines of communication then become stretched. because it is not easily accessible by sea. So it's not quite the same as ruling something, say, in Syria, which is not that far from the coast. Now the communications become a bigger problem, and also the frontier that this exposes becomes much broader. Not to mention that it opens you up to a lot of desert, and there's no way to conquer Arabia in this era for the Romans because there just aren't enough cities there to hold down everything. So I don't think it was all that achievable in the long run, but I don't think it was impossible either. It would have required a pretty big reimagining of the administrative structure of the empire. And this might have only worked later on when the capital's at Constantinople, so that way you shorten the line of communication a bit. Either that or you have to be comfortable with more governors who have a lot more empowerment and independence, which would kind of undermine both the Republican and the imperial systems. So I don't think it could have really been done by Rome during antiquity, or even during the early Middle Ages. Yes, fuck Cicero. I have not studied Tigranes the Great to any extent, actually. I mean, I know who he is, but that's about it. Nero was terrible, yeah. I mean, I would say he's just kind of like below average bad, but not horrifically bad. Biggest Dickus. Let's see. I don't know the exact speed, but I know that it is not super fast. It could take weeks sometimes. Now, messengers could travel a lot faster than armies, obviously. But still, to get from the interior of Asia all the way to Rome is probably about a month. Now, maybe from Mesopotamia it's 3 or so weeks if you're really hustling. But I would say at least a month if you're well connected and you have a specialized messenger. Yeah, I'm not sure what a friend of Rome would mean in that particular context. I mean, it might have been something that meant something in Carthaginian politics. Kind of like a friend of whatever special interest in American politics, right? The ancient Britons were... I'm pretty sure they were Celtic. I don't know for sure, but I've always thought they're Celtic. Why did the Greeks and Romans think that having small wieners was the ideal? They looked at themselves, they saw how big their dicks were, they looked at the barbarians, saw how big their dicks were, they saw their dicks were a little smaller, and they said, well, obviously that's the way to go. We're cooler than they are, so it's what everybody likes, small dicks. Yeah, imagine from a place like Syria, you might be able to pull off 2 weeks as long as it's sailing season. Winter also fucks things up, by the way, because it makes it way harder to sail, even in the Mediterranean. Oh, so you want to make a connection between the Strabo's colony and Cato not wanting to grant land to more veterans. That could be. That could be. I hadn't thought of that. I assume you're asking the source of the dick thing. That would be art history. I'm not an art historian. This is just something I know from being around art historians. So I don't know exactly what book you'd have to read for that, unfortunately. One thing I really want to find, that I read this text in a grad seminar. I don't remember the name of it. I'm not sure exactly what century it was from, but it was from Egyptian monks in either the 2nd or 3rd century. And they were living out in the desert. They were ascetics. And the goal of the text was to figure out the significance of morning erections for one's piety. So the whole text is about, well, we've done everything in our power to make sure that we don't get these things because we know that they're impure and terrible. So we've intentionally gone on diets that mean that we're malnourished. That way we're less likely to get boners. We deprive ourselves of things all the time to make sure that we don't get these things, and sometimes they still happen. And we also have noticed that younger men tend to get these more than older men. Now, there are doctors who say that this is an age-related thing, but we choose to think that it's actually based on piety. Older men just have more piety because they've been working on their souls longer. They've been, expunging all these negative thoughts out of their minds. So it's one of those things where it's funny because the person who wrote this has clearly read the medical science of his day. So actually the ancients had a pretty decent idea about how and why people got erections. Even if they didn't quite understand reproduction fully, they did understand erections fairly well. So they know exactly why people get erections, or have a pretty good idea. And then they're saying, well, even though it makes no sense, we're choosing to believe this thing anyway about why erections do or don't happen. So anyway, if somebody can find me that text in terms of what it's called and where to find it, I would be very, very grateful. Because I really don't want to have to email the professor who assigned it. I haven't talked to that guy in a long time, so... Caesar said Ariovistus was a friend of Rome and his war commentaries. I mean, I assume it might mean that he had a... I wonder if there was a diplomatic thing in terms of having an official status at Rome, in terms of having a place to stay. I don't know. I'm sure if it does have an official meaning, it probably has something to do with diplomacy. I'm more familiar with the Greek norms about that kind of stuff. Every city had a proxenos. So if you went to Athens and you were a Spartan envoy, you'd visit the Athenian proxenos, or proxenos. And that guy would not only let you stay at his house, but he would then go up to the belay with you and introduce you. He'd say, this is so-and-so from Sparta, and he brings a message from his people. So I imagine Ariovistus probably had something similar to that. That'd be my guess, at least. Okay, well, yeah, that's just a way to conduct diplomacy. And diplomacy in the ancient world was much more personal than what we think of as diplomacy. There aren't state departments or anything like that. It's just the big players in any given state make friends overseas, and then they interact with one another. And some of those positions are actually heritable, too. So you can actually inherit your position as the official representative of Sparta from your dad. And basically, that would be the norm unless you do something to fuck that up. Alright, guys. Well, I am going to peace out here. I got some things I need to take care of, but it was good to see you all and chat with you a bit. I expected to have a longer show, but, things happen, so nothing can be done about that. You think Byzantines would survive if the Arabs took Constantinople? Hard to say. It depends on when they would have taken it. If they took it at the low ebb of Byzantium, then that's probably curtains. I'm not a big cook, no. I cook once in a while, but I'm not really that great at following instructions, so cooking is not really one of my talents. Anyway, thank you all for showing up, and I will see you all around. Hopefully this week will be part 5 of Basil II, but we'll see. I planned on doing that last week as well. Didn't quite happen. Anyway, see you all around.